Welcome to Eat.Drink.Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. Today, we're speaking with Barton Seaver. Barton is a trained chef who stepped away from successful restaurant work to dive into a career in food systems, sustainability, and specifically sustainable seafood. As a chef, Barton cooked in Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., where he worked with Jose Andres. He's a member of the United States Culinary Ambassador Corps, and he's worked with the National Geographic Society. He was director of the Sustainable Seafood and Health Initiative at the Harvard School of Public Health. Barton is a prolific writer and a public speaker. His books include For Cod and Country, Simple, Delicious, Sustainable Cooking, and The Joy of Seafood, the all-purpose seafood cookbook with more than 900 recipes. Barton was recently a keynote speaker at the 2024 Edible Institute in his home state of Maine, and after his talk, I was eager to sit down with him and have a conversation about the state of seafood as it affects feeding the growing number of humans on the planet, seafood sustainability in its various forms, and of course, the delights of cooking and eating. Barton, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Woohoo! I'm so thrilled to be here, especially with you. Thanks for this invitation.
Absolutely. So beyond or wrapped up in your sustainability work, I don't think it would be overstating to call you a seafood evangelist, and maybe you've actually used that term yourself. You're pretty enthusiastic about lots of aspects of eating from the ocean, and we'll get into the whys later. But can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you down this path?
Sure. And again, thanks for this invitation and opportunity to be here with you and to be speaking to the entire edible community. I think you're awesome. And in many ways, I have molded myself after so many lessons I've learned through interacting with these communities all across the board. And also what you really represent in aggregate. Local is not the only answer, but rather it is the system of people thinking in aligned ways about why food matters, what we hope to accomplish with it, and how do we go about doing that? And that's to speak a little bit sort of to my origin story on this. I was born and raised in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where food was an exceedingly important part of these new American realities. And communities from Ethiopia, Eritrea, El Salvador predominantly had brought with them their traditions, their ways of identifying themselves through the table, through food systems. And that was so imprinted powerfully upon me at a very early age, just the power of food to express ourselves, to discover ourselves, and to really decide and refine what matters to us. So it was no surprise when I graduated from high school and discovered college was not for me, that I discovered that kitchens were, in fact, for me, and had a career that took me in and around and all over the world in some really great kitchens with some really great chefs. And it was Chef Jose Andres in DC, as well as my mentor, Robert Egger, the founder of DC Central Kitchen, that really showed me that chefs are more than the sum of ingredients that we put on a plate, but rather that we are an important cog in this wheel that helps to not only sort of enable, but lubricate the way this world works around us and where we hope to get in it. With the seafood work in particular, to me, seafood is just the most interesting ingredient category. I mean, the seasonality, the taste, the textures, the colors, the inherent variations. And I'm talking about just salmon alone, right? And then you get into all these different species, and it's just so interesting of a category that I fell in love with it. And also fell in love with the communities behind it. And began to see that we had a real responsibility to not only sustain the resource itself, the biology, but to also sustain the people behind it, the biography of these communities that really matter. And that has informed my path and why I am thus here.
I'm also curious. I think that you had some experience with fishing a little bit at some point in your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I lived and worked as a fisherman in Morocco for a little while in a little village called Suira, the arts capital down there, and just saw firsthand the labors and aspirations of the communities that went out every day in the noble pursuit of putting dinner on people's tables. And as much as we have long lauded the American farmer, the thread by which the fabric of this country, this colonial country, was woven, there's so much of that same nobility that I think we need to ascribe to to the fishing communities. And a large part of my work has been exactly that, is sort of to showcase and to highlight the people behind it. And thus, sort of my seafood evangelism is to showcase the good that comes through to all of us through seafood.
In your talk at the Institute this fall, you quipped about three top public health ideas: wear your seatbelt, don't smoke, and eat more seafood. Tell us a little about the public and personal health reasons for making seafood a bigger part of anyone's diet.
Sure. When it comes to just the acute nutritive benefits of seafood, switching the American diet from, reducing red meat consumption twice a week and replacing that with small, adequate, sustainable portions of seafood that's rich in omega-3 fatty acids, would have such outsized impact on our public health outcomes. So a 36% reduction in cardiac mortality instances would result. A 17% reduction in overall mortality incidences. You have incredible benefits to helping manage diabetes, weight gain, weight loss. You have macular generation as well as preventing against degeneration. When you start talking about the benefits to both mama and baby of eating seafood in utero and while breastfeeding, you're talking about a significant increase in IQ outcomes. You're talking about a significant increase in mental well-being outcomes for mama, which is, hey, like anything we can do to support mamas, like that is our societal mission. If any, there should be, right? And seafood is, in fact, a tool to accomplish that. And as you mentioned, as I say, the three S's of public health are just that: eat, smoke, don't smoke, wear your seatbelt, and eat seafood. The positive outcomes from those three actions are so high that they stand together, really to the point where uh, people consider it. Some of my colleagues at Harvard consider it and called it an epidemic of a lack of omega-3s in the American diet. And the simple and positive outcomes that can come from that are just so remarkable. And when we talk about broader macro impacts of seafood on public health, I think first and foremost has to be to address the greatest threat to public health that humans have ever faced, which is climate change. And seafood is, yes, a part of the problem on that, but it is also, when done right, a huge part of the solution to climate change. Not only just replacing red meat, where terrestrial animal agriculture accounts for almost 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So taking more of that out of our diets, replacing it with seafood in many cases would be a really great thing. And when we just think about the efficiencies of seafood, you and me and pigs and cattle and chickens, we don't notice this, but we're living in a really harsh environment with atmospheric pressure and gravity, and we got to spend a lot of energy to keep our brains and our blood warm, and we have to grow big bones and lots of connective tissue just to exist in this world. And a fish? No, dude, that's cool. I just float. There are biological and physiological efficiencies at play in a buoyant natural environment that just allow for a more efficient use of ultimate resources. And when we begin to think about seafood sustainability, so often it has been done heretofore with blinding lenses on of, is this or is this not biologically sustainable within this narrow vantage point of its place in the ecosystem, which is absolutely essential. But in the United States, in North America, the audience of the local edible communities, we have to think about seafood sustainability in the ways that it's used, which is as a center of the plate protein, right? And therefore, we need to measure it against beef, pork, chicken, lamb, veal, goat, and turkey, the things we actually eat. And when we do so, seafood just has a fin up in the sustainability game.
So I wonder, and we'll get talk more about the environmental aspects of this in a minute, but I'm wondering, as we're talking about public health, and we extend the idea of seafood as a public health win to the most vulnerable in our population, I'm thinking about the barriers to making seafood an everyday or a few times a week part of the plate versus an occasional splurge of a meal. And those barriers are not just cost. They might include having time to cook, having access and availability to something that may have a lot of perishability, having experience in preparing what might be a relatively novel protein. How are you thinking about these ideas of access?
Sure. Access is very important. And it's absolutely essential to this conversation. The bottom line is, though, that seafood is actually rather accessible in ways that we don't often give it credit for. And there's ways that we could really augment to make more accessible. First and foremost, we're not always talking about high-end species and sablefish and Chilean sea bass and king salmon. Like, there's a lot of pink salmon out there. There's a lot of, tilapia out there that's raised in relatively good uh, situations where, that I support, that I've seen and visited firsthand, and that I happily eat. There's also sort of behavioral aspects of sustainable seafood that I call them, which is, hey, we need to be eating more frozen seafood. Why? Well, it's better for the fishermen. It's better for the environment. It doesn't cause economic collapse when, say, 74 million sockeye salmon come streaming back into Bristol Bay. You think the market can absorb that? Absolutely not. It would take 2 years to absorb that. So we need to invest in frozen seafood cold storage as a means to extend the season. We as consumers need to walk into the frozen seafood aisle with expectations that we're going to get a great meal, which these days is pretty commonly available. There's also canned seafood, pouch seafood. Seafood is actually the only sustainable food that you can get at most gas stations, right? I mean, it's it's kind of amazing. That said, yes, seafood is more expensive. And what I'm about to say does not address a working mom with 3 jobs, 2.5 jobs, public transport, kids to feed, kind of the world stacked against her. Like, I get that. I am not speaking about that here. The cost of seafood is what I would say rational. The cost of meat is not. We pay for meat 4 times, if not 5. First, with our taxes and our subsidies for corn and ethanol and all the other things and all the fossil fuel based fertilizers that we maintain a military complex in order to sustain our, fossil fuel interests around the globe. And I'm not talking conspiracy theories. Like, this is a lot of what we spend our tax dollars on, or farm subsidies. We then pay for it again at the store. We pay for it again with our failing health and the Western diet that we know causes. It is the number one cost to the US economy, is our lack of thriving, our lack of good quality public health. And we're paying for meat again with climate change. And so if you think about how those, we only look at one price point in there, which is what we pay at the grocery store. But the cost of meat, the true cost of meat, is exponentially greater than what we understand it to be. And so when we talk about, as a society, what should things cost? Well, things should cost a little bit more like what seafood does. And then we utilize these market aspects to bring those costs down, to make them more accessible and to make it culturally relevant.
Hmm. So you talked before about the idea of the farmer, kind of the fact that there's a significant amount of mythology and maybe even generational storytelling around the idea of the farmer. And even though what might be in people's heads about how farming works likely doesn't equal what's happening in our industrial food system, if you ask somebody, imagine a carrot in the field, they likely could do it. And seafood gets to the fishmonger and to our plates without a lot of knowledge and visibility about the supply chain. It actually grows beneath the surface of the ocean. Who's involved, who's profiting, who or what parts of our oceans might be suffering for that market. So you're a natural storyteller. And I can imagine you've thought about this part of the challenge of getting folks to understand where seafood come from. Can you share any thoughts about that?
Sure. The mythology of small American farming uh, is so core to our identity. We literally sing songs of it. The amber waves of grain, the fruited plain. It's written into the Constitution in the way that, uh, agrarian principles sort of form the basis of land ownership. Land ownership, according to Jefferson, was the surest form of political prosperity and stability. uh, this was really the upwelling of our, early colonial nation. Whereas, in fact, the first white footsteps on this land were taken likely off the backs of a codfish. And it was the cod that, in fact, was the the stepping stone upon which this young nation, took its first steps towards economic and political freedom. But we turned away from the tempestuous waves of the North Atlantic and the cod fisheries there towards amber waves of grain, as we discovered just endless vast tracts of fertile land that we then took from the indigenous populations. But we settled in that way. We settled on this land, and we still now lack that connectivity to the water. Fisheries happen in rural coastal communities. I live on the coast of Maine, where it's a little bit different because I live next to lobstermen and women. My kids go to school with oyster farmers and their daughters and sons and daughters. It's just it's more integrated. Why do people come to Maine? To eat lobster and look at pretty pictures. This is a wonderful place. It's very integrated here. But if you go to Long Island Sound or Boston or San Francisco or elsewhere, San Diego, these really once great fishing towns that have now relegated everything to one quaint little tourist destination wharf, where it's really a quirk of the local place and really more of a lesson in history than it is about any commitment to fisheries being part of our current identity. And that is why it's so difficult. Fisheries happen executed by someone else, somewhere else. And what needs to happen is, as I was saying about my time in Morocco, like really understanding the civic and social values of what fishermen provide. And if you stand on the dock and gaze wistfully out at a wine dark sea and think that fishing happens out there by someone else, well, there's an automatic disconnect. But if you stand on that same dock and you turn around and look inland and look at the quality of roads and public housing and quality of education available to people, look at the opportunity there is for generations to stay in their place, to do their things in their own traditions and heritage. That is what a fishery is. It is the sum of the labors and aspirations of a community. And when we see that, we see ourselves reflected in not only their process, but their product. And when you put that on a plate and celebrate that, as we in this community do with the food that we eat, we create that incredibly valuable connection that ultimately fosters a dialogue about what we want our relationship with the oceans to be.
So, one of the ways your thinking and work has evolved over time relates to the word sustainability. I heard you characterize the idea of sustainable as a bare minimum. Can you talk about some of the environmental and ethical challenges around increasing the amount of food that humans eat from the ocean and how we might do that in a way that's more than sustainable?
Mhm. Sure. Sustainability is, to me, a really unsexy idea. Uh, I think back to great human accomplishments, like putting a person on the moon. Like that was a good one, right? Like that was hey, everybody, let's come together. Let's come up with a really sexy, literal moonshot and then put our resources and our attentions behind it, right? Cool. Put a person on the moon. That's a really great idea. Sustainability? Hey, let's change the way we do things. Let's alter our economy. Let's refocus our agendas and our intentions, and let's make these sacrifices and shifts. And then, if everything goes right, everything will stay the same. Okay. Crickets, right? Because it's like, well, yes. I mean, what we've got is really great. But in the American pantheon and mythology, like, growth is the model. Shiny and new is what's bright and sexy, right? And sustainability is kind of, uh, it's just lacking in that appeal to people. I mean, I get it. I would certainly really love things to be the way they are. In fact, maybe a little bit better towards decades past. But the bottom line is sustainability doesn't really just inspire resolve. So we need to think past that. And also sustainable, able to be sustained, maintained in its current condition. It's like, well, okay, there's really nothing sexy about that. Uh, and also, I mean, are we really supposed to congratulate ourselves about not screwing something up? Like, I, I mean, I like to think of myself as a good parent, and there's lots of things I didn't do today that to my children that would be criminal, but like I don't consider myself a good parent for not doing those things, right? We have to find better ways to pat ourselves on better things to pat ourselves on the back for. So to me, I'm past sustainable seafood and really talking now about seafood that matters, meaning what are we using this seafood to accomplish? And there are so many avenues that we're beginning to discover and explore and understand in terms of how seafood is a tool to accomplish larger aims. And my work, when I set out, it was very much this idea that, like, hey, people, we got to fix seafood. And there was a lot to fix, and there still is. So, to be clear, when I call myself now a seafood evangelist, I am not giving a free pass to the truly horrific things that still exist out there and absolutely must be addressed at all cost. But that's not to say there's an entire other category of seafood that's being done right in ways that really have intention. And that's what we need to be focused on. What are we using this seafood to accomplish? Is it preservation of heritage and culture, as is so important in Alaska, as is so important here in Maine with the Penobscot Nations? Like, what are we doing to encourage and enable the legacy and endurance of peoples and their place? Is it women's economic empowerment? Well, aquaculture, when done right in a developing world, is in fact a direct means to begin to create economic opportunity for women. Why? Well, because it's a brand new economy, and so there's not a traditional male workforce that must be displaced. And to be clear, that is a ridiculous reason for women to not have access to a workforce. But bottom line is, we know that that is a significant barrier. So, in a brand new economy, it creates new opportunities and new avenues for engagement. And when we talk about some of the aspects of farming, particularly of shellfish, bivalves, and seaweeds, we begin to see that we're talking about a restorative economy. And even then, moving past that into finfish aquaculture and beginning to look at innovations in feed production, we begin to see that seafood might actually be the recipient and sort of the end value aspect of a circular economy system. And so to me, it's this really interesting nucleus for a lot of these other large scale, sort of human scale conversations that we're engaged in.
I'm wondering if we can maybe imagine some specifics here. Let's talk about aquaculture. You've said
Yeah.
that the needed growth in seafood can only come from aquaculture, but like every industrial scale agriculture, there are huge environmental, ethical, and human costs that come with large scale aquaculture. You've alluded to some, but I'm curious if you can share a form of aquaculture that fits your concept of seafood with intention.
Mhm. So certainly bivalves and shellfish, where you have small owner operator farms that are operating within the commons in ways that improve the commons. So oysters, clams, mussels, farmed scallops, seaweed. I would say it's actually our patriotic duty to eat as many of those as we can. I think it's the only food that I recommend outright overconsumption of. Why? Because the world is a better place and our economies are better for us eating that oyster. And you know what? If we ate two, it would be even better. And that's not to say that we should just be negligent about our consumption, but like in fostering and encouraging and growing those economies is a really great thing uh, in every aspect and across the board. When it comes to larger scale production, I've seen firsthand some examples of very corporate funded operations that in fact are doing some real good and that are in fact raising fish in ways that are respectful to the fish, respectful to the environment, respectful to the culture and the economy in which they operate, respectful to the end user as well, in terms of delivering a product that people would actually want at a price point that they can afford and participate in. From open blue cobia down in Panama to the great aquaculture programs out in Hawaii, uh, and then certainly some of the recirculating aquaculture systems that we're beginning to see, land-based systems. And while these are corporate funded, venture funded even, and I hesitate to give credit to many things that are venture funded in terms of their intentions, but bottom line is we know and have seen that there are companies that have reduced their ecological footprint by going 100% renewable energy, that are using circular economies in their feed, which is about 80% of the cost for raising a finfish. It's also the vast majority of the environmental impact. And whether that's using trimmings from large-scale fisheries such as wild salmon or North Atlantic whitefish in place of forage fish coming in. So instead of feeding them anchovies that we caught for that specific purpose, feeding them things that we don't eat from fish that we have already caught. But more than that, we're beginning to see there's technologies advancing that fermented sugarcane waste is becoming protein for fish. You're beginning to see sawdust, mycelium, mushrooms, even algae-based feeds that are fermented. And furthermore, there's even some bacteria that are being inoculated into the cooling stacks of steel mills to capture carbon and become protein in themselves. They're just sort of absolutely wild things. And I understand that might be a little scary to people who believe that a carrot should just come from the ground and like that's it, and we shouldn't mess around with these systems. But in a population that is growing with a demand for seafood that's expected to triple within the next few decades, uh, simply put, if we know how to do these systems right, in ways that we can articulate the benefits to community, to user, and to environment, then I think we need to be thinking about these systems at least in an exploratory light, or as I do, in a positive light. We owe that, I think, to the larger conversation and to whose voices we're actually speaking on behalf of when we ask ourselves the very difficult question of how are we going to feed all of these people?
I guess two things I want to kind of pop back to in what you were saying. One is just the idea of forage. I think maybe people aren't aware that fish eat fish, and to feed fish in aquaculture, a lot of wild fishing has happened.
Mhm.
And then when that's not happening, some of the things that people might not be aware of is that industrial agriculture is at play in terms of maybe potentially feeding corn and soy to fish as a replacement for fish meal. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So very large scale fisheries for fish that, well, basically form the basis of the marine food chain. So we're talking about sardines, anchovies, capelin, small little forage fish that swim through the water and filter out plankton and zooplankton. So it's the first step up from the primary energy of the sun blooming nutrients into life that they then filter out. The biological survival mechanism of species in that category, sort of the second step on the trophic scale, is fecundity. Basically, there's so many of them that you've seen like a National Geographic special when the bait ball gets rounded up by the dolphins and then the birds come in and then the whales come in and it's like, oh my God. And then there's like 8 sorry, really sad surviving fish that swim off and they're like, oh my God, what just happened? And guess what? Each of those fish has 200,000 babies twice this year. And the whole thing happens again. So those fish are meant in the system. Their position is to feed a lot of other things. That is the purpose of life, right? To eat and be eaten in many ways. Uh, that we took a lot of those out of the ocean in order to feed farmed salmon, for example, was a mistake. It absolutely was a mistake, but it's something we've also learned and are moving past and beyond. I know there's a huge amount of contention around farm salmon, and a lot of that was very much earned. But we also haven't, I don't think, given farmed salmon in particular sort of a fresh look in terms of what has been evolving and evolving uh, in that scenario. There's still a lot of bad out there. You mentioned corn and soy that go into the makeup of some of these new fish feed formulations. And you know what? I'm going to point the finger at myself for making some of that happen. Why? Because I was an early advocate of farmed and dangerous. Don't eat farmed salmon. How dare you, salmon producers, use all of these forage fish? How dare you? I was very vocal about it. What I didn't offer them was a solution. And what happened is that it ended up going to corn and soy and other cheap commodity products that could fill that gap. So, as a personal responsibility, I feel it's like, well, if I drove them in that direction, I have a responsibility now to help them move past that as well. And that's where some of these new innovations in aquafeed are going to come from. And that's what I'm so excited about. Again, I acknowledge that this might not sound good to all of your listeners right now. But it also, I would ask, really, is that we come to it with fresh eyes and understand the industry for where it is now in its current position and what its potential is. And Amy, I know you're joining your home state in Alaska and all that. It's very, very important to state that not all forms of aquaculture belong in all places. Through transubstantiation, your community and salmon are literally one and the same being. Like, to then say that, hey, I'm going to put a salmon farm in there is absolutely not appropriate. It's a form of colonialism and economic colonialism that just shouldn't be. But to then say that doesn't belong on the shores of Maine, in an old paper mill where we have an opportunity to do this, and a community decides, after being fully educated on the pros and the cons, if they decide to bring it in, then I think then we should allow for that as well.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to Alaska because that's where we're going. But I do want to come back to the forage fish a little bit later because I think that sardines and those fish are great to eat as well. And maybe we should talk about that a little bit. But
Yeah.
here in Alaska, where I live, as you mentioned, there's an inherent bias towards wild fish and a deep rooted skepticism about farming salmon, a migrating species in confined pens, which have not only ethical considerations, but environmental risks as well. And as you said, you believe not all forms of aquaculture belong in all places, but salmon farming, even far from where wild stocks still exist, have challenges. So you mentioned that idea in Maine. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. But I'm curious how you think the world's relationship to this species should evolve.
Mhm. First, I think it's important to put some context onto salmon farming, which is that it started only 65 years ago as a global thing, and really it didn't take off until the mid 80s. By and large, salmon was chosen to be farmed because there was an existing market for salmon. Who was providing that salmon? Well, Alaska mostly, and a little bit of California. So there was an intent outright to then take some of that market. Not necessarily maliciously, but to say, hey, we're going to tag along with the existing preferences for salmon. Now, salmon is not an easy fish to farm. And in fact, if we were starting aquaculture over today, brand new, I don't think salmon would be on the docket at all. It's very difficult, and it's taken us many generations of salmon to figure out how to do it better. You're absolutely right to say that there are far-reaching impacts of a farm, even if it's in Norway or Chile, and you're talking about its impacts on Alaska salmon. Well, they might not interact, but they certainly do in the marketplace. And they certainly do in ways that have diminished both the cultural capital of wild and of farmed. And it's become really an us versus them conversation. The global market for salmon, is increasing by about 6% every year, but global production can only increase by about 2%. So there's already, to me, a big enough economic pool to play in terms of how much salmon can be absorbed into the marketplace. There's a huge amount of complexity to unpack in that, yes, but there is opportunity there. And then to minimize the impact we might have on an ocean ecosystem, we can bring the farming onto land. And I've seen very successful iterations of this. In fact, I was just out in Idaho at some trout and sturgeon farms where aquifer water is literally flowing out of the hillsides. You can't stop it into the river systems. And just for a few minutes, we capture that water and raise trout and steelhead and sturgeon in it. filter the water and then allow it to pass through back into the ecosystem as good of quality as it did when it came out of the canyon walls. That's flow through systems. There's also recirculating aquaculture systems where the water is captured into a net pen. The quality of that water is then really regulated through various processes. And then the fish are raised in that, and then the water also flows back out. Uh, that prevents escapes. It allows for greater growth at times because you can control temperature, you can control the environment, you can basically always make it spring if you want to, as opposed to in an ocean ecosystem where you are with the seasons as they are. So there are some efficiencies to be recognized and realized within such systems. And there's also ways to bring seafood production directly to the people that are interested in consuming it. There's a lot of dilapidated mall space in New Jersey that's already been heavy upped with electric and water that could, in fact, become pretty good aquaculture sites that directly feed into the metropolitan area. We're seeing this in Wisconsin. We're seeing it in North Dakota. We're seeing it in California, and in exciting ways that I think shift the narrative about what we're trying to accomplish with this.
So I want to think about the ethical considerations. You often pit seafood against land based protein as having a fin up in the environmental aspect. But as much as you wouldn't want to eat, perhaps, I'm not going to speak for you, but as someone might not want to eat a egg that comes from a confined chicken that never was able to flap its wings. Can we talk about that aspect of fish farming where the fish, especially when we were talking about salmon, that's fish that migrate in their natural life, confining them to this pen or whatever form of confinement they have during their life cycle. Talk about the
Mhm.
ethical considerations of that.
Sure. And to be honest, that's not an area that I think we have explored enough. So, to give some context from an industry perspective, we are now really looking at fish species that do better in captivity, meaning their behavioral, psychological, and physiological traits better adapt them to such environments. You wouldn't raise a school of tigers together. You wouldn't raise a whole lot of lobsters together. Why? Because they all eat each other. There's some species that just shouldn't and can't be farmed. You can't raise crabs together. Why? Well, because they eat each other. It's not a very good farming model, nor a really good ethical model. Uh, but some of the evidence that we're seeing, and this is not my area of expertise, but I would say that the evidence that we're seeing objectively that growth rates are improving, not because we're pumping them full of growth hormones or antibiotics. In some cases, yes, that's happening, but in good farming, it's not true. So it's genetic selection for fish that perform best. We're looking at fish behavior and understanding that they're not showing signs of stress. They're not in need of food. Their environments are stable. They're not predated upon. So some of this basic physiological data that we're beginning to see suggests that these fish, I wouldn't call them happy. That's not the word, and I don't understand fish psychology, but they show evidence that they are living in an environment that suits them. What are the ethical, off roads, on roads to this? I welcome your thoughts on it. And this is part of my learning to it. Tell me, what do you think?
Well,
And not to challenge you or not to take, the onus off of me. That's not the purpose here.
yeah, no, I think that it raises a lot of questions when we talk about confining an animal that doesn't live that way naturally. I think that that raises questions in agriculture, and it also raises questions in aquaculture. And as eaters, life is really complex already. And we have talked about, we've added to a lot of that complexity today in our conversation by talking about, what people should think about, eat more seafood, but not the seafood, is a challenge. And I think it sometimes leaves the eater going, oh my gosh, what do I do now? So I love that you have laid out a few things that are pretty easy yeses. Let's have some oysters. Let's have some kelp. Let's have mussels. And maybe we can add to it, let's have some wild salmon. Canned pink salmon, for instance, is inexpensive.
Woohoo!
And yeah. So, yeah, I think maybe we can circle back to what are the easy yeses and what do we want to be cooking for dinner at this
Yeah.
point? Because I think it's great that that you're thinking about all the complexity and giving time to it. And, I am looking forward to seeing what happens in the fishing industry. And one of the big worries always is how big interests, like you mentioned, of investment, capitalism, corporate investment can lean things towards profit as opposed to the considerations that
Mhm.
I hear you saying are the most important: people thriving, the planet thriving, the animals thriving.
Yeah.
So,
And there's a huge amount of complexity there, and there needs to be a bit of both. I'd love to see it be, everything that edible community represents and touts and celebrates. But I also understand that that's not really a feasible, logistically, possibility right now. Uh, and getting back to that sort of animal welfare thing, it's when corporations do it wrong that the antibiotics show up. Like, we have not only examples of doing it right, I think those examples are further proved by the fact that we have examples of what happens when it goes wrong, when those fish really are stressed and under duress. Um, but as I said, I've also seen the corporations that are thinking about this the right way, and I've seen the economic studies that show to raise a fish sustainably, and I was doing air quotes there for the listeners, uh, is in fact ultimately more profitable. So my hope is that these two concepts really begin to align to showcase what's possible. So back to your question about some easy yeses. So farm raised shellfish, farm raised bivalves, done. Please, please, please eat as many as you can. Farm raised, Alaskan salmon. It's one of the great, truly great, magnificent resources we have. Paul Greenberg, the great author, and a friend of mine says we have a strategic oil reserve. Well, we should have a strategic salmon reserve too. Well, and the fact is, we do. It's called Bristol Bay, and we should protect it and treasure it at all costs. But there's also some behavioral sustainability aspects that come into this. So earlier I was talking about forage fish and their role in an ecosystem. So to your listeners, if you can imagine a diving board. Okay, at the base of the diving board is the marine food chain where it begins, which is contemporary energy of the sun, coming down into nutrient-rich waters and blooming plankton, microscopic sea plants that are then eaten by microscopic life called zooplankton. And then forage fish come along and taking a step out on the diving board. And then you've got fish that eat those like mackerel and others. You got them a step out on the diving board. And then all the way out the end of the diving board, you got tunas, sharks, marlins, the big, sexy, charismatic species that we love to catch and eat. And isn't it the biggest one that's the best, right? So think about what happens on a diving board. If you jump at the very end of the diving board, what do? You leverage the system for its biggest impact, right? You make a big old splash and a giant ripple. What happens if you jump at the base of a diving board? Nothing. The system absorbs your shock, right? Well, what happens if you jump right here in the middle of the diving board? Well, the system is a lot better designed to absorb our burden there. Eating smaller, not small, no, smaller, but like lower on the food chain is inherently a good idea. It's just more rationally sustainable. Another thing that we really need to focus on with seafood is diversity. Diversity is the foundation of sustainability of everything, whether it's your stock portfolio, your society, biology. Nothing monolithic stands for long. But in America, 90+% of the seafood we eat comes from just 10 species. Of that, salmon, shrimp, and tuna represent almost 65%, just right there. Uh, but when we engage in an ocean ecosystem, it is far more diverse than that. But we are not willing to engage with it, to pay for it. And there's a cavalcade of negative outcomes from this. One is which the fishermen can't profit from a hake or a dogfish as much as they can a cod, right? But why should we irrationally demand cod when the hake is actually fresher and better today? And well, that's what the environment gave us, so let's take it. When we drag a net through the water, yes, up comes the cod, but also the hake and the haddock and the pollock and cusk and ling and monk and skate and wolf and dog and eel and ray and plaice and plaice and dabs and flounders and witchbacks and I mean, like, I could go on. And these are all just flaky white flesh fish. And they were all caught right here in my harbor here in Maine. These are all New England flaky white flesh fish. Why would we exclude everything but the cod from our preferences when all of them are equally profitable to our body for the purpose of dinner, and all of them should be equally profitable to the fisher community because they all cost about the same to the ocean when we take them out, right? So we need to rationalize the economy, make it based on supply rather than on demand. Would be a huge step in the right direction towards rationalizing and sustainable and making more sustainable our fisheries.
Can you talk us through a couple of weeknight meals that might have less popular or less thought of seafood?
Well, you mentioned canned pink salmon. That's a great one, but better than canned pink salmon, I would say, is frozen fillets of pink salmon. I think it's a really beautiful fish. It tends to be caught so far north and so far out of our supply chain logistics that canning is basically the best way to get it down to us. But with recent advances in freezing technology, frozen pink salmon is a delight when it's done well. It is lean, it's clean, it's got this sheen of moisture to it that just endures. It's got a tenacity of flavor, not in the way that sockeye has with its rich, robust, sort of ochre hues of Pinot Noirness, like that I just love, right? Its gaminess, but like pink salmon is just ebullient and fresh, and it's got this lamination of fat that just runs right underneath the skin to provide this sort of self-basting effect to the fillet. I mean, hot damn, this is good eats, right? How do I cook it? Well, you can't see it, but I turned around and pointed at my toaster oven. That cost me $110 at the local store, and it does most of my cooking for me, and I cook it directly from frozen. Pink salmon fillet, skin on, out of the package, Tuesday night, salt, toaster oven, 20 minutes later. Ba-ba! There you go. Guess who eats it? Kids.
What temperature?
What temperature do I cook it at? Probably about 300.
Slow cooking.
So low and
Yeah.
slow, it's always the best way to do it. Almost any fish, low and slow, is a great thing to do. So that's one of my go-to meals. Is just that any fish straight out of the freezer. But another one, I'm just going to be perfectly honest with you. I'm a parent, and parenting is about survival in many, many ways. And both my wife and I work full time, and so Annie's mac and cheese is it's part of our reality. And throwing in a can of good quality, intentionally sourced tuna and some peas. And you know what? I can pat myself on the back for surviving. I can pat myself on the back for giving mostly nutritious food, and life goes on. And yeah, so I'm not necessarily recommending that to you. Of course, you can roll out your own pasta, then get out your pasta maker and roll out your own macaroni, and then spend the afternoon drying it, and then go to your backyard and harvest the milk and some rennet and make your cheese. And I mean, yes, we could do all these things, but many of us are parents. It's just not feasible. So live in reality and just be good.
What about forage fish? Do you have a meal that you like to make with that includes anchovy, sardines, any of those other little fish that are so good for us that we kind of forget about eating?
Sure do. So anchovies end up in a lot of what I make. I go through about 24 tins of anchovies a month. Why? Because if I'm sauteing zucchini, I start off with my garlic and olive oil and the oil from a 2-ounce can of anchovies. I then get the garlic nice and crisp, and then I add in the anchovies. And as soon as they melt, dissolve, disappear into that now just so well punctuated olive oil, the squash goes in. I add the salt immediately so that it begins to exude its moisture, and so it begins to kind of create this emulsion as it simmers in the olive oil, and it becomes this thick, rich sauce punctuated with those anchovies. I mean, hot damn! Okay, wait, what was the dish? It's zucchini, but it's just made better. And then what do I top it with? Fresh mint. Anybody who has ever grown mint knows the only way to control mint is to either mow it or eat it. I prefer to eat it in everything. To me, it's one of the most ebullient, fun, charming herbs. It's like salt and lemon juice in that it makes things taste more like they are. It just gives them a lift, something happy to feel about. And yeah, so that's another one. And then sardines, simply straight out of the can. I mean, they're good. I use Tapatio hot sauce. Done.
It's definitely a great work at home lunch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can of chickpeas and a handful of lettuce, and you're done.
Cool. So, all right. What is on your plate in the next year or so, metaphorically speaking? Do you have any new projects that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. Well, I've got another book coming out in October of next year, so a year plus from, or just under a year from when we're recording this now. But that'll be called Blue Food Cookbook. So it's a story about really what's going right, and a nuanced discussion of what needs to change and where the gray areas are. But ultimately, it's a cookbook. It's a permission for you to fall in love with seafood, you, the eater, to fall in love with seafood as a category. Um, our idea is to sort of exonerate it. Seafood is considered guilty before proven innocent in so many ways, and that yet there's so much going right that should be, heralded above the fold in our news media, but simply isn't. So we're trying to draw some attention to those stories. I'm co-authored with Andrew Zimmern on this, the great chef and TV personality. So check that out. But I'm also working with some large scale food service companies. So some of the very biggest in the world and some very big hotel chains about engaging with them, what I call participatory sustainability. All too often, sustainability is thought of after the fact. And you're looking as a chef at your sales sheet saying, I guess I'll buy the certified one, or the Monterey green one. Great. Like, good. Absolutely. We need to be thinking about that. But large corporations should also be helping to reverse engineer sustainability all the way down the pipeline. And that's to engage with producers that really need to be a bigger part of our economy, whether they're small scale and the innovation is really in supply chain logistics. Cool. That's not sexy, but it's sustainability in a pure form. How do we get the right producers to the right users? Some of it is even selecting which species to menu and just saying, can we design menus that are not dependent upon cod, but are dependent upon the haddock or the hake or the cuskerling, the monkey, all of the other flaky whitefish. How do we change menu approaches to further enhance and enable sustainable practices? Working with them, just use more frozen seafood and to get over their biases towards that. Etc. So there's a lot we can do, including not throwing seafood away. 50%, it's estimated, of all seafood that's caught, captured, and makes it to U.S. market gets thrown away. So that's a big thing we're working on, and thanks for the question.
Well, we look forward to your book when it comes out, and maybe at some point we'll get to have you back and get an update.
Well, I'd love that.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the conversation, and thanks for challenging questions. I really appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to explore this with all of you.
We've been speaking with author, chef, and seafood expert Barton Seaver. Thank you for joining us today at Eat.Drink.Think. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.